Hi! For this assignment, I decided to listen to This American Life. The podcast episode name was That's a Weird Thing to Lie About, and it was broadcast on February 28th, 2025. The topic of this podcast episode is exactly what you'd think it is. It's about lying, why people lie, and different types of lies. This podcast episode is split into 4 different parts with 4 different topics under the umbrella topic of lying. The overall style and method of the podcast is primarily interviews with people, with the hosts cutting in to provide some more context and background on what they were discussing at the time. The first section of this podcast episode was about little white lies as a cultural norm. The host brings on a person with autism to talk about their experience with people telling little white lies as this social and cultural norm, and how people with autism often find it really strange that we do this. The guest goes on to say that she almost never lies. The only times she will lie are to protect herself and others. And when she says protect herself and others, she means life or limb kind of protect, not I don't want to hurt this person's feelings kind of protect. She tells a brief story about how she was helping someone escape their abusive household, and when the husband came calling asking if she had seen them, she said no. The host talks about how he uses little white lies all the time at work, mostly to reassure guests on the podcast that they did a good job, even if he didn't really think they did. And her response?
I think that most of the time, if the person you're speaking to didn't do well, that they're going to know it. And so the polite fiction is not going to reassure them. So what is the honest thing you could say in that situation? The honest thing is, coming to do this, to have these conversations and be open and vulnerable is a big thing. And I really appreciate that you did it and that you made the effort. Thank you for that.
The guest's opinion on lying is that honesty is the only way to create vulnerability and intimacy, which I totally agree with. She talks about how she's honest with her kids and her nieces and nephews because otherwise they're not going to have a very strong relationship. The second segment is a little heavier and at the same time a little funny to me as someone who grew up with their mom looking over their shoulder on social media saying, "Don't trust everyone you meet, they're probably not who you think they are." If you've ever seen the show Catfish, this is kind of the same thing, but a little worse. In this section, the main guest was a journalist who started a blog back in the early 2010s about wars, primarily. The journalist and her editor were in charge of a blog that had a lot of traffic on the page. One of their stories, and the main focus of this podcast, was about the blog of a lesbian living in Syria at the time during a war. This journalist had been following this Syrian activist who was blogging all of their experiences in Syria for a while. Eventually, one day on her blog comes a post saying it was from her cousin that the person who ran the blog had been kidnapped by Syrian authorities. A bunch of big news outlets start writing stories about it, but very soon after, a lot of doubt starts flooding in about who this person really was. So people start to do some digging. Some different journalists found the image of the person who was supposedly running the blog, but the image of the person did not match the name of the person running the blog. And some more digging. They look into the IP address of the blog. It belongs to Scotland. Then they get a hold of one of the friends of the person who ran the blog, and she gives them a mailing address, which leads them to the United States, in Georgia specifically. That address leads them to a married couple, the woman who had been studying Syria and had been there a few times before. There were many points of connection. One of the big ones was that there was an image on the Syrian blog that was also on the wife's social media and existed almost nowhere else. The original journalist who started talking about the story can't find a contact for the wife, but is able to find a contact for the wife's mother. So they call the mother, and the mom says she doesn't think it's her daughter, she thinks it's her daughter's husband, because her daughter's husband is always on the computer, always asking all these questions. So the journalist gets a hold of the husband, calls him, and He kind of laughs it off the first time, saying that if he was the genius that did this, he would take credit for it. The journalists call him immediately back the day after, and then he starts to get aggressive and defensive about it. Eventually, there's a post put up on the Syrian girl's blog that has an apology about why he did it. He also changed the name of the blog. The apology he posted was one of those not really apologies where he just defended himself and said he was doing it to help people. And since this journalist was already on a spree, she decided to contact one of the people she had previously talked to about this Syrian woman. The thing that got the journalist suspicious was that she was only able to talk to the dad of the person running the blog.
It's the exact same thing as with Amina. Like, I can't talk on the phone, so I'll have to do it in this alternate way. But in this case, I'm deaf. And, I didn't want to doubt Paula being deaf, but
Right.
the dad was so weird.
Right.
And now I'm basically like, is every single person on the internet actually just a white dude pretending to be someone else?
So the dad of the person running the blog admits that he was the person and he was actually using his wife's identity, and his wife had no idea. And although this man admitted to faking the identity immediately, he also tried to defend himself by saying that he was just trying to help. The third section of the podcast episode is about bully lies, specifically about President Donald Trump and his bully lying. They start with the example of Donald Trump blatantly lying within his first few minutes of his first day of his first term. The things he lied about were very easy to disprove. We have eyewitness testimony and video evidence of this not occurring. So, why were people believing him? That's when we introduce the concept of a bully lie. As the guest of this podcast explains it,
the Trumpian lie is different. It is the power lie, or the bully lie. It is the lie of the bigger kid who took your hat and is wearing it, while denying that he took it. There's no defense against this lie because the point of the lie is to assert power, to show I can say what I want when I want to. The power lie conjures a different reality that demands that you choose between your experience and the bully's demands. Are you going to insist that you're wet from the rain, or give in and say that the sun is shining?
So, bully lying is all about asserting power over others. My peer-reviewed source that I chose is also about why people lie. The article is titled, "The Truth About Lies, a Meta-Analysis on Dishonest Behavior." It was published in 2019 by the American Psychological Association. In this article, the authors examine many different studies on lying and that sort of behavior and try to figure out why people lie. There were 4 different types of studies done that they looked at. For purposes of brevity, I'm going to split them into 2 categories. The first being ones where there is multiple factors or answers, such as rolling a dice, where there are 6 different possible answers. The second category is the coin flip study, where there is only 2 answers. In that first category, where there are multiple answers, about 50% of people lied. In the coin flip study, only about 30% of people lied. As the authors explain, people only lie as much as they think is believable and that they can get away with. It's way more believable to say that I rolled a 5 on a dice than saying I flipped heads on a coin 8 times in a row. Some of the other factors that went into these experiments were ethics and money. In general, people tended to lie more if there was more money on the line. One thing that increased levels of honesty was reminding people of ethics right before the experiment started. The fourth and final section of this podcast episode definitely had a much lighter feel to it. This section was one of the people that works at the radio station defending Little White Lies. He's not talking about social normative lies, he's talking about lies that are just harmless fun. He tells a story about his dad, who is a professor, and how one day he joined his friend in his dad's class on a day they were going to take a test. The day of, the dad introduced him as his son and said he was from Nicaragua, even though he very visibly was not. This caused the dad and the friend to just crack up laughing while everyone else sat there confused. And that was the fun part, was that they really confused people, not only because of the lie, but because it was so funny to a small group of people. All in all, this joke was just harmless fun. these people in the class were not going to be deeply affected or for very long affected by the heritage of their professor's son. The host/guest talks about how he stopped lying for a period of time for the sake of his wife. He and his wife don't specifically remember the little lie that set her off, but eventually she told him to knock it off because it was maddening for her. But now he's decided to bring back these funny little lies with his children. His eldest son is now old enough to kind of understand when he's joking or not. This person even is of the opinion that it's probably a good thing to be able to tell fact from fiction in this day and age, which is definitely true. I think overall, this podcast had the effect on the listener to get them to think. The listener might decide to think about their own lying and why they do it, but also it encourages the listener to think on their own, look deeper into things, find their own research, and not be pressured into believing things just because someone with power said so. This podcast, in comparison to the one I listened to for assignment number 1, definitely felt more put together and professional, which is of course to be expected because this was from a larger company rather than one person. But I did really love the way that there was subtopics under the big umbrella topic. It always kept the podcast feeling fresh and new with its information, and it never felt like it was padded for time. All in all, this was a great podcast episode, and I've grown to really enjoy This American Life as a podcast in general. I think it has some great topics. And with that, this is Sarah Reed signing off. Thank you.